ओके, प्रार्थना के साथ आज के क्लास हमको शुरू करेगा। पुष्प सिस्टर आप प्रार्थना करें।
प्रेज़ द लॉर्ड। धन्यवाद प्रभु, धन्यवाद प्रभु, धन्यवाद प्रभु। स्तुति हो प्रभु, स्तुति हो प्रभु, महिमा हो प्रभु। हालेलुया, हालेलुया। हमारे प्यारे खुदावन प्रभु परमेश्वर, हम आपको धन्यवाद करते, स्तुति करते परमेश्वर। आज का हमारा क्लास आपका हाथों में समर्पित करते हैं प्रभु। अब हम सबको स्वर्गीय ज्ञान और परिज्ञान से आगे चला दीजिए। खास करके प्रमोद सर के लिए प्रार्थना करते हैं परमेश्वर। आपका दास को आप स्वर्गीय ज्ञान और परिज्ञान से भरकर पवित्र आत्मा से क्लास कराने के लिए आप सहाय दीजिए। और हमारा सबका जीवन में अनुग्रह का कारण बनने के लिए प्रार्थना करते परमेश्वर। हमारा सतवेदा बाइबल कॉलेज के लिए प्रार्थना करते परमेश्वर। जॉनसन सर और सारा फैकल्टीज के लिए प्रार्थना करते हो, सारा स्टूडेंट्स के लिए प्रार्थना करते हो परमेश्वर। प्रभु हम पढ़ते सब कुछ आपका नाम का महिमा के लिए, आपका राज्य का बढ़ोतरी के लिए इस्तेमाल हो जाए परमेश्वर। हमारा सबका जीवन आपका हाथों में समर्पित करके प्रार्थना करती हूँ। प्रार्थना और बिनती प्रभु यीशु मसीह का नाम से मांगते हैं, सुन और ग्रहण कर प्रभु परमपिता। आमीन।
कैसे എല്ലാവരും ക്ഷമായിരിക്കുന്നോ? Hope you all are doing fine.
Yes, we are fine.
നമ്മളെ ബൈബിൾ സർവേ ആണ് ജോൺ സാർ എടുക്കുന്നത് അല്ലേ? ബൈബിൾ സർവേ, introduction to Bible. What's the name of title of the subject?
Introduction to Bible.
Yeah, he asked me to explain Gospel according to St. Matthew. Today we are going through the introduction part of Gospel of Matthew. Yeah, we all much aware about the Gospels. As we know, I think we studied earlier, Gospel can be divided into two, Synoptics and Johannine Gospel. First three Gospels known as Synoptic Gospel. पहला तीन Gospels Synoptic Gospel का रूप से हम परिचित थे। Okay. Matthew, Mark, Luke. Yeah. Like other three Gospel, the first Gospel is frequently asserted to be anonymous. As we all know, the text we can't see who is the author. Authorship anonymous. That's true. While reading, we can recognize any direct evidence. This is formally correct when compared with the Pauline or other letter. When Paul or other apostles, while writing their letters, they starts with addressing. Yeah. We start with a designation of the author. However, we have no evidence that these Gospels ever circulate without an appropriate designation. ഈ പോളിന്റെ ലേഖനമൊക്കെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ മറ്റു പല ലേഖനങ്ങളും ആരെഴുതിയെന്ന് ആരംഭിക്കുന്നു. എപ്പിസ്റ്റൽസ് ഓർ ബിഗിനിങ് ചില പുസ്തകങ്ങളുടെയൊക്കെ ആരംഭത്തിൽ തന്നെ നമുക്ക് കാണാം അത് ആരാണ് എഴുതിയെന്നുള്ളത്. ഇതിൽ അങ്ങനെ എഴുതിയിട്ടില്ല എങ്കിലും ആരാണ് എഴുതിയത് എന്ന് പറയാതെ ഇത് പ്രചരിപ്പിച്ചു എന്നതിനും പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് തെളിവുകളൊന്നുമില്ല. ഇങ്ങനെ പറയാറുണ്ട്, it was held for long that this gospel got their designation sometime during 125 AD. Until then, they were anonymous. But some recent studies shows that titles were necessary in the ancient world to identify a war to which any reference was made. पहला century में gospels means without टाइटल सर्कुलेट करने का रीति से एक बात है। फिर recent scholars क्या बोलते हैं? Recent studies show that titles were necessary. Title जरूरी है ancient world to identify a work to which any reference was made. Okay. One of the scholar, Martin Hengel, argues that as soon as two or more gospels were publicly read in any one church, a phenomenon that certainly occurred, he thinks not later than AD 100 it would have been necessary to distinguish between them by any such device as title. The unanimity of the attributions in the 2nd century cannot be explained by anything other than the assumption that the title were part of the works from the beginning. Thus, Hengel concludes that the 4 canonical gospels were never ever formally anonymous. The very beginning onwards, even though we cannot see the title in the gospel, it circulated with specific authorship. That was his opinion. The most important external evidence comes from early as beginning of the 2nd century in the words of Papias, one of the Greek church father. Papias words like this. Papias speaking about the Apostle Matthew composing a gospel, the saying of Jesus. Apostle Matthew composing a gospel. Church Father Papias words. The Apostle Matthew composing a gospel which is supported by Irenaeus also. Irenaeus, another Greek bishop, he lived AD 130 to 202. He also agrees that, supported that. Without exception, the church fathers understood the first gospel was written by Matthew. Church fathers, they believed that the first gospel written by Matthew. Apart from these are several other arguments raised from the text itself and from the other gospels with regard to authorship of the first gospel. Few of them we can see, apart from external evidence, few of them. First one, only this gospel refers to Matthew the tax collector. Matthew chapter 10 verse 3. On the assumption of apostolic authorship. This is the best seen as gentle self-addressing, humble self-addressing expression of gratitude for the freedom of grace. Chapter 9 verse 9 to 13, we can see the story. Second, in Mark chapter 2 verse 14 and Luke chapter 5:27, the whom Jesus calls from his role as tax collector is identified as Levi. In the same story, Matthew chapter 9 identify the man as Matthew. in Mark chapter 2, Luke chapter 5, the man whom Jesus called for his role as tax collector is identified as Levi. In the same story, Matthew chapter 9 identified the man as Matthew. All the three synoptic gospels, the first three gospels, in their respective list of the apostles, name a Matthew and Matthew. Matthew 10:3 identify this Matthew, the tax collector. The responsible assumption is that Matthew and Levi are one and the same person. Thus, the writer clarifies this dual name is in his gospel. While reading Mark and Luke, we can see Matthew, but in Matthew, clearly we can identify the Levi and Matthew are same, because there we can see the explanation, the call of Matthew, otherwise the call of Levi as a disciple. Third, the assumption that Matthew was a tax collector and was the author of this gospel makes sense of a number of details in the gospel. A number of peculiar Matthewian pericopes do depict financial transaction. We can see some financial transaction, something related to financial matter. The tax collector, Matthew the tax collector, is explain about some financial matters. Thus we can recognize Matthew wrote this gospel. The distance the gospel has from theological development, like in Paul, may point to the author as one who was with Jesus, who did not receive much as the gospel speak about the disciples at the beginning. അതായത് പോളിന്റെ വേദശാസ്ത്രപരമായ ചിന്തകൾ ഇതിൻ്റെ അകത്ത് നമുക്ക് കാണുവാൻ കഴിയുന്നില്ല. അതുകൊണ്ട് യേശുവിനോട് കൂടെ അടുത്തുണ്ടായിരുന്ന ഒരു വ്യക്തിയാണ് മാത്യുവിന്റെ സുവിശേഷം എഴുതിയത് എന്ന് ചിന്തിക്കുന്നതിൽ തെറ്റില്ല. 5. The reference of Jesus was speaking on behalf of the Jews speak of the author as a Jew. The reference of the Jesus as speaking on behalf of the Jews speak of the author as a Jew. യഹൂദന്മാർക്ക് വേണ്ടി സംസാരിക്കുന്ന യേശുവിന്റെ പരാമർശങ്ങൾ ഗ്രന്ഥകാരൻ യഹൂദനാണ് എന്നുള്ളതിന്റെ ഒരു ഉത്തമ ഉദാഹരണമായിട്ട് നമുക്ക് പറയുവാൻ കഴിയും. ഇന്റേണൽ എവിഡൻസ് ആയിട്ട് പറയുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങൾ, the first one, only this gospel refers to Matthew the tax collector. केवल यहू सुसमाचार में टैक्स कलेक्टर का उपयोग, मत्ती द टैक्स कलेक्टर, ऐसा उपयोग ही केवल ये गॉस्पेल में परिचित है, सूचना है. Second one, in Mark chapter 2 verse 14, Luke chapter 5 verse 27, the man whom Jesus called from his role as a tax collector is identified as Levi. In the same story, Matthew chapter 9 identified the man as Matthew. All the three synoptic gospels, in their respective list of the apostles, name a Matthew, identify this Matthew as the tax collector. The reasonable assumption is that Matthew and Levi are one and the same person. Thus, the writer clarifies this dual name in his gospel. The third one, the assumption that Matthew was a tax collector and was the author of this gospel makes sense of a number of details in gospel. We can see some financial transactions, Matthew chapter 17, 24 to 27, 18 to 23, 25, chapter 18, 23 to 25, chapter 21 to 6, chapter 26, 15 to 15, chapter 28, 11 to 15. We can see some financial transactions details through the explanation. The fourth point is the distance the gospel from the theological development like that in Paul may point to the author as one who was with Jesus, who did not receive much as the gospel speak about the disciples at the beginning. The fifth one, the reference of Jesus as speaking on behalf of Jews speak of the author as a Jew. 5, internal evidence. Okay, next topic is date of the Gospel of Matthew. When Gospel of Matthew written? Generally, the Gospel of Matthew is dated between AD 80 to 100. However, the reason put forward for this assumption also are based on judgments that were disputed by many. Few of arguments are മത്തായിയുടെ സുവിശേഷത്തിന്റെ തീയതി സാധാരണയായി AD 50-നും 80-നും 100-നും എഴുതിയ കാലഘട്ടത്തിലാണ് എന്നാണ് വിശ്വസിക്കപ്പെടുന്നത്. എന്നിരുന്നാലും ഇത് പല തർക്കങ്ങൾക്കും കാരണമായ കാര്യമാണ്. അതിൽ ഒന്നാമത്തെ കാര്യം the Matthian use of Mark. മത്തായി മർക്കോസിന്റെ സുവിശേഷത്തിൽ പറഞ്ഞിരിക്കുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങൾ ഉപയോഗിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട് എന്നുള്ള കാര്യമാണ് ഒന്നാമത് പറയുന്നത്. Most scholars today hold that Mark is first gospel and Matthew borrowed from Mark. Most of the scholars present believe that Mark is the first gospel and Matthew borrowed from Mark. The date for Mark vary between AD 55 to 78. And highest point is favored by most, hence a date of Matthew before 80 seems impracticable. However, the early church considered Matthew to be the first gospel, and there are many even today things in this light. Hence, it is not easy to date this gospel. On the other hand, even if Markan priority prevails and if Mark is dated to AD 60, there is plenty of time for Matthew to be published before 70, when Jerusalem and its temple was destroyed. The first thing, the Matthian use of Mark. Most scholars today holds that Mark is the first gospel and Matthew borrowed from Mark. The date for Mark vary between AD 55 to 70. And the highest point is favored by most. Hence, a date of Matthew before AD 80 seems impracticable. However, the early church considered Matthew to be the first gospel, and there are many even today think in the same line. Hence, it is not very easy to date this gospel. On the other hand, even if Markan priority prevails, and if Mark is dated to AD 60, there is plenty of time for Matthew to be published before 70. Even Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed. Second point, the reference in gospel to be the reference in the gospel to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and to the church make many to say that the gospel was written after AD 70. It argued that though cast as a prophecy, the reference showed the knowledge of
Excuse me,
history.
sir. Excuse
That
me,
is
sir.
the history of
Sir, excuse me. Little slowly, you please. Slowly.
Okay. The reference in the gospel of the destruction of the city and to the church make many to say that gospel was written after AD 70. It is argued that though cast as a prophecy, the reference show the knowledge of history. That is, the history of Jewish war of AD 66 to 70. However, this cannot be an argument because Mark is mostly considered to be written before AD 70, equally predict the fall of Jerusalem. We can see Mark chapter 13, Matthew chapter 24. The reference to the church, which taken by many as showing interest to the church order, is without any church as such in Matthew, and hence cannot be taken for a late date. The church, and we say, is simply the messianic community. Once again, I will explain. The first is use from Gospel of Mark. Many scholars believe that first Gospel is Mark. Matthew borrowed from Mark. The first century, many of the first century Christians, they believed that Matthew written first. The reference in the gospel to the destruction of Jerusalem city and to the church make to many say the gospel was written after AD 70. The third point, the reference in Matthew to the effect that something or other has continued to this day are frequently taken as evidence that there was a long interval between the events of Jesus' day and the time of writing. The reference in the Matthew to the effect that something or other has continued to this day, Matthew chapter 27, 8, 15, and frequently take as evidence that there was a long interval between the events of Jesus' day and the time of writing. But how long is a long interval is still question. Even if the gospel was written after 3 decades, after 30 years would make a long period. Fourth point, some argue that the book shows high tension between Jews and Christians, and hence it might have written during the period of such tension. Some argues that the book shows high tension between Jewish community and early Christians. Hence, it is might have written during a period of such tension. Fifth point, the Apostle Matthew is judged to be the writer. A date before AD 70 is more. Fifth one, അപ്പോസ്തലനായ മത്തായി ആണ് എഴുത്തുകാരനാണെന്ന് വിശ്വസിക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ AD 70 കൂടുതൽ വിശ്വസനീയം. Sixth point, the early church fathers are unanimously assigning Matthew an early date. ചർച്ച് ഫാദേഴ്സിന്റെ ഒക്കെ അഭിപ്രായം മാത്യു അത് AD 70 തന്നെ എഴുതി എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. Seventh point, some sayings of Jesus might be taken to indicate that the temple was still standing when Matthew wrote. When Matthew wrote the gospel, during that time, the temple was standing. Seventh point, eighth point, some passage might, according to some, suggest a period during the 70s. Chapter 24, verse 20, 28, 4, 19, some reference from Didache, first century teachings.
4 verse.
കൂടുതൽ ആളുകളും വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നത് മത്തായിയുടെ സുവിശേഷം AD 70 കൂടെ എഴുതപ്പെട്ടു എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ തന്നെയാണ്. എന്നാൽ പല വിധത്തിലുള്ള ആർഗ്യുമെന്റ് ആ വിഷയത്തിൽ ഉണ്ട്. അടുത്തത് പ്ലേസ് ഓഫ് ഒറിജിൻ. ദി early tradition ascribed the work to be from Palestine. പാരമ്പര്യമായി വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നത് പാലസ്തീനിൽ നിന്നുള്ള ഒരു എഴുത്താണിതെന്നാണ്. Jerome specifies ties it to Judea. Certainly a Palestine origin makes sense in many ways. The inclusion of Aramic words without translation. We can see some Aramic words without translation. The assumption of certain Jewish customs. We can see some assumption of Jewish customs. Some bilingual character of the text form of the Old Testament is cited, and the adoption for literary purpose of forms of speech that are more typically Semitic than Greek. The early tradition believed that the gospel from Palestine. Certainly a Palestine origin makes sense in many ways. The inclusion of Aramic words without translation. We can see some Aramic words without translation. It supports Palestine origin. Matthew chapter 5:22, 6:24, chapter 27, verse 6, the assumption of certain Jewish customs, the bilingual character of the text forms when the OT is cited, Old Testament is cited, and the adoption for literary purpose of forms of speech that are more typically Semitic than Greek. However, large number of scholars nowadays for Syria as the place of origin opted. Large number of scholars nowadays believe that the place of origin is Syria. This choice depends primarily on two factors. The adoption of the date after AD 70, by which time most of the Palestine was destroyed. സിറിയ ആണെന്ന് വിശ്വസിക്കാനുള്ള കാരണം പാലസ്തീന്റെ തകർച്ചയുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട കാരണമാണ്. And the influence of Streeter, who argued for Antioch as the provenance of this gospel. We already discussed about that the possible date of publication might be before AD 70. This has to avoid the second argument as well. The early witness of the Antioch bishop Ignatius cannot be a valid reason for placing the gospel from there, though the argument in other way as well, it is not very conclusive. Hence, we cannot be so clear about the place of origin of this gospel. We can see two arguments. One is gospel from Palestine, another belief this gospel from Syria. Destination. Next point, destination. Leshasthanam. Since the book has so many Jewish features, it is not easy to imagine that the author had a predominantly gentle ordinance in mind. Something that Matthew ministry may have included people of different localities, and hence he had certain kind of readers in his mind rather than their geographical location. However, these readers might have been predominantly Jewish. Destination. Since the book has so many Jewish features, so it is not easy to imagine that the author had a predominantly Gentile audience in his mind. Something that Matthew ministry may have included people of different localities, and hence he had certain kind of readers in his mind rather than their geographic location. However, these readers might have been predominantly Jewish. Next, purpose of the book. Matthew does not state his purpose. So the purpose derived are in reference from his themes and the way he treats certain topics as compared with the way the other gospel treat similar topics. Matthew does not state his purpose, so the purpose derived are in reference from his themes and the way he treats certain topics as compared with the way the other gospels treat similar topics. We may find many dominant themes in Matthew because Matthew devotes so much space to OT. Matthew devotes so much space to OT, Old Testament. Some have suggested that he wrote his gospel to teach Christians how to read their Bible. We can see lot of quotes from Old Testament. Some have suggested that he wrote his gospel to teach Christians how to read their Bibles. Some others appeal to the same reference to infer that he was carrying to evangelize Jewish. He was trying to evangelize Jews. Or perhaps he wrote to train Christians to sharpen their apologetics as they wrestled with Pharisee Judaism of their own day. Some he wrote to train Christians for apologetical purpose, for standing against Pharisees and their teachings. Some have thought that Matthew is aiming to confute inception antimonism, since he devotes space to say of Jesus' teaching of law. Yet others have appealed to the same evidence to argue that Matthew was a master churchman struggling to develop a distinctively Christian ethical structure, and to do so in a way that retained the unique place assigned to Jesus without offending too many Jewish sensitive over the law. Other suggestions argue that Matthew wrote to train leaders of the church or as a catechism for new converts. Other suggestion argues that Matthew wrote to train leaders or new believers as a catechism. Apart from this, one of may easily find Matthean stress of following Jesus as the promised Messiah. While reading, we can understand some of these goals. Jesus as the promised Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man, Emmanuel, the one to whom the Old Testament points. Many Jews, especially Jewish leaders, failed to recognize Jesus. The promised eschatological kingdom has already dawned in the life, death, resurrection, and exaltation of Jesus. And this messianic reign is continued in the world. As believers submit to Jesus' authority, this point to say the gospel was wrought to meet various needs, in particular to equip the early church to do evangelism. Many goals we can see. While reading, we can understand the Matthew aims that prove Jesus as the promised Messiah. Jesus as the promised Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man, the Emmanuel, the one to whom the Old Testament points. Many Jews, especially Jewish leaders, failed to recognize Jesus. The promised eschatological kingdom has already dawned in the life, death, resurrection, and exaltation of Jesus. And this messianic reign is continuing in the world. As believers submit to Jesus' authority, this point to say that the gospel was brought to meet various needs, in particular to equip the early church to do evangelism. Finally, we can see the outline. The first part, chapter 1, we can see birth and infancy, childhood stage. Prologue, the first part, prologue, birth and infancy. Second, narratives, proclamation and appearance of the Messiah. Third part, teaching, Sermon on the Mount. Then narrative, miracles in Galilee, chapter 8 and 9. Then teaching, the mission of the 12, chapter 9 to 11. Again narratives, growing hostility, chapter 11, 12. Then teachings, the kingdom of heaven, chapter 13. Again narratives, chapter 13 to 17. Again teaching, the church, chapter 17. Then narratives, the way to Jerusalem, chapter 17. Eschatological teaching, chapter 24, 1 to 25, then 46. Epilogue, passion, death, and resurrection in chapter 26. The outline of Matthew, prologue, birth and infancy, we can see in chapter 1. Again, we can see narratives, proclamation and appearance of the Messiah. Then we can see the teaching, Sermon on the Mount. Then we can see the miracles in Galilee. Then teachings, something related to the mission of 12 disciples. Then growing hostility. Again teaching the kingdom of heaven. Again narrative, shadow of the cross. Then teaching about the church. Then narrative, the way to Jerusalem. Then teaching related to eschatology, we can see in chapter 24, epilogue, passion, death, and resurrection. So the notice, I think, already with you. You can again read and understand the theme. The rest of the part, our Johnson sir will teach you. Okay, thank you. Shall we pray? प्रार्थना करेगा, प्रार्थना के साथ समाप्त करेगा. ब्रदर श्रेयस, अब प्रार्थना करें.
प्यारा पिता परमेश्वर, हम आपको धन्यवाद देते हैं आज की सुंदर शाम में. प्रभु, हम सारे स्टूडेंट्स सत्यवेदा थियोलॉजिकल कॉलेज से लेके प्रभु जितने भी फैकल्टी मेंबर्स है, प्रभु हम सब स्टूडेंट्स मिलकर कुछ समय तक ये थियोलॉजिकल टीचिंग्स सीख रहे थे प्रभु. और प्रभु आने वाले दिन पे ये टीचिंग्स को लेके प्रभु हम सही तरीके से प्रभु आपके राज्य पे उतर पाए और आपकी काम कर पाए. प्रभु ये जितने भी स्टूडेंट्स ये टीचिंग्स ले रहे, मैं प्रार्थना करता है कि प्रभु सबको आप बराबर ज्ञान से भरिए प्रभु, ताकि प्रभु सच में आने वाले दिन पे आपके राज्य के कामों को कर पाए. और जितने भी टीचर्स लोग प्रभु उनको ये टीचिंग सिखा रहे प्रभु, सबको आशीष कीजिए प्रभु. उनके जीवन आपके हाथ में हम समर्पित करते हैं, सारे स्टूडेंट्स को आपके हाथ में हम समर्पित करते हैं. धन्यवाद प्रभु, ये सुंदर समय आपने दिया. ऐसे ही आगे हम प्रभु ये टीचिंग्स को लेते रहे और सच में आपकी महिमा कर पाए. सारे बातों आपके हाथ में रखते हुए प्रार्थना में आशीष मांगते यीशु मसीह के नाम से.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Praise God.
सिस्टर, हमारा क्लास खत्म हो गया है, अभी आप लीव कर सकते हैं। നല്ലൊരു മെസ്സേജ് ഇട്ടേക്കോ. എന്താ ക്ലാസ് ഫിനിഷ് ക്ലാസ് ഈസ് ഓൾറെഡി ക്ലാസ് ഫിനിഷ് ഓവർന്ന് ഫിനിഷ് ഈസ് ഓവറോ ഗോട്ട് ഓവറോ ക്ലാസ് ഈസ് ഓവർ നല്ല ലീവാകുന്ന പിന്നെ മെസ്സേജ് അവര് കട്ട് ചെയ്യല്ലേ. ഈ എന്ത് Class is over. Please off the Zoom window. അവരെല്ലാം ഇതാക്കണം. ഇനിയിപ്പോ എന്തായാലും ജോയിൻ ചെയ്തു. എന്താ നമ്മൾ കട്ട് ചെയ്തല്ലേ?